Welcome to FARview, the podcast of the Foundation for Auditing Research. Welcome, dear listeners and viewers. Today we have three guests in our podcast. That never happened before, I think. So we welcome Anna Gold, Dominic Detzen, and Marshall Geiger. And they are members of a research team examining auditors' going concern decisions. And in this study we're going to discuss today, they particularly used actual insights from practice, which is kind of uncommon. So before we start off, maybe you can briefly introduce yourself, Anna.
Sure. So my name's Anna Gold. I'm a professor of auditing here at the Vrije Universiteit. This is one of my FAR projects that I'm working on. I also work on some other FAR projects, so I'm very grateful to the FAR for allowing us access in this way to audit practitioners and research data. I do research. I teach auditing here at the Vrije Universiteit at the master level, supervised thesis.
Okay, Thank you. Dominic?
I'm Dominic Detzen. I'm a colleague of Anna's at the Department of Accounting at Vrije Universiteit. I'm an associate professor of accounting. And I also teach on a bachelor's and master's level, mostly financial reporting, but since this year also in auditing. And I guess in my research, I mostly look into, also auditing financial reporting related issues, mostly using qualitative methods. And I guess that's also what brought me into this research team.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Marshall?
And I am Marshall Geiger. I am a professor of accounting at the University of Richmond. I do a lot of auditing research, and I teach in research as well in financial reporting. So I guess this is my second FAR project, so I am very grateful that they're also interested in going concern, which is something I've been interested in for way too long now, several decades.
Oh, that's a long time. Well, actually, your fourth group member, research team member, is Philip Wallage. He's not here today. He's here, but he's not in the podcast. You previously already did a going concern project for the FAR. That was without Dominic, I think.
Yep.
So that was Anna and Marshall and Philip. Was there another one involved?
Yes, that was it.
So how does this current study we're going to talk about relate to the literature review you did?
So the first project that we did with the FAR, that literature review, was really, in my mind, I guess, a continuation of the literature review that was published in the journal, Auditing a Journal Practice and Theory in 2013 as part of a bigger litany of issues in auditing that the AAA wanted literature reviews on. So the FAR had asked for proposals in, I think, 2017, so we applied and were lucky enough to be asked to pick that up. So we did that literature review, and eventually that was published in a research monograph. I think it was published in early 2021, and it extended the review of the literature from the 2013 publication onwards. So, I thought there'd be several papers, not nearly as many papers as there actually were. So we had probably twice as many papers as I thought we were going to have to review in there. So a lot of work. But in that process, certainly it was very salient that a lot of the research was archival, empirical. There were some experimental papers in there, but the vast majority of the papers were archival, and I'm guilty of this. Most of my work is archival as well. But what became pretty obvious is that we really don't know. We make a lot of assumptions in those archival studies about how going concern opinions are made. What are the determinants of going concern opinions and so on. And some of that is really just kind of blind assumptions because we don't have a very good understanding. So pretty much the ones that I can remember that actually interviewed practitioners was back in the 80s. So Tom Kidda in 1980 and Jane Mutchler in 1984, their dissertations were based on actually discussing and kind of interviewing audit practitioners about the going concern issues. And since then, 40 years ago, pretty much, we haven't had a whole lot of research that has tried to replicate that to see what the current practice is. So that was the genesis for this second proposal.
So why was now the moment then to start this study?
Well, I think it was a great springboard after that literature review to say here is a real gap in the literature for us to look more qualitatively at how our decisions actually made to contribute to that whole literature stream, and hopefully, as kind of we'll talk about, I think in a little bit, how to inform future research as well.
Mm-hmm. And why is that important?
Well, I mean, going concern is fundamental.
But why are the interviews important to add knowledge?
Because we don't know whether the assumptions that we make are accurate. Most of the literature assumes that lead auditors make those decisions by themselves, and we just look at correlates of that. But we found that in our process that typically is not the case. There's a whole lot of actors involved with that decision, and some of the things that we simplified in earlier research, maybe we should really kind of go back and look at expanding that notion of who actually makes the decision. So that was eye-opening for me.
So was that driven by practice comments or?
I mean, the importance of the topic has been there for a long time, I think, although it kind of flares up every now and then. And during recent COVID times, I mean, that was pure coincidence because I think we were already working on the project when COVID hit, but that has made it even more clear how important the issue is with companies running into financial distress, in this case due to COVID, but then also the war in Ukraine hit, and we see that in the interviews as well. That was another trigger for many companies to run into problems. And then we know what will happen is that this has an effect on the financial statement audit, because one of the responsibilities of the auditor is to also provide an opinion if there is material uncertainty about the continuity of the firm. The auditor should issue an emphasis of matter paragraph, which we call the going concern opinion. Mm-hmm. It's become even more important now here in the Netherlands, as practitioners know, for public interest entities. All audit reports have to now include a paragraph on going concern and fraud, for that matter, regardless of whether there are material uncertainties. So I think one can safely say the topic is more relevant than ever, even though I'm not sure that was actually the driver behind our choice to look at the issue, because we thought it was interesting even before all this happened. But that puts going concern opinions even more in the spotlight. Mm-hmm.
And I guess one additional thing that you also, the two of you, as well as Philip, conducted was this focus group. Mm-hmm. That was also a major impetus to show how much appetite there actually is to enable some kind of exchange and correspondence between the firms, but also between practitioners on the whole topic. And vice versa, I guess, if I recall from watching the video of the focus group, how, there were some kind of mismatches between certain research findings that did not resonate as well with practice, and also vice versa, that actually research could inform practice about certain issues that was found in academic studies.
Okay. Maybe you can tell a bit more about how you studied this, what method you used.
So we actually started out with a small set of pilot interviews. So based on our own network, and we've been in touch with the NBR with their working group on continuity. And based on that, we conducted a number of pilot interviews to get sort of a sense of what is actually going on, what are the issues that drive these kinds of decisions, and who is involved, and what are sort of the procedures, broadly speaking. And then in the next step, actually, the FAR was very helpful in terms of helping us identify people that could inform our study. And so from that point onward, we identified, in total 39 interviewees that we eventually talked to. And these ranged from, basically nearly all the participating firms in the FAR. And they were of, different function levels, but also of different capacities. So some of them were involved in the going concern panels that some of the firms have. Some of them were involved in the national office or technical departments. Some of them were specialists. And I guess the large majority of the people that we interviewed were audit practitioners. And those were mostly, I guess, at the director and partner level. Only very few people that were senior manager level. But based on that, we went out and interviewed 39 people and asked them, how they do this in their practice, in their audit practice, and how they experience that difficult decision.
So the firms selected the people you could talk to.
Exactly. So we did give some indications, obviously, in terms of who we wanted to talk to. And I guess one thing that we also realized that this was not something that each and every auditor has experienced in their career. So it's rather that, this is a very unique situation that you have. So we're really, as I like to say, in the tail end of the distribution that, for the large majority of firms, things are actually going well. And then you have a smaller set of firms for which, things are not looking as rosy. And there, sort of going concern really plays a role, and you need to go through the formal going concern assessment. And so essentially, we asked the firms to help us identify people that have gone through a difficult going concern decision, a going concern assessment, and difficult, very, very neutral in the sense of, with the help of a going concern panel, but also with the involvement of specialists or something that they could tell us about in the sense of how this works in practice.
So, but did you also talk about firm policies, or how was it structured? Was it just an open interview? What do you do when a going concern might be at hand, or just in general? What are you going to say about the going concern situation here, or how did that work?
So essentially, there are different ways to do interviews, and that would have been one approach that we just ask about. Walk us through your salient experience with the going concern assessment. But what we decided on was, broadly following that one single question, but really coming with more detailed question. And there, of course, sort of the experience of Anna, Philip, and Marshall came in terms of what are certain triggers for going concern assessments, what are certain issues that are at play, who is involved in those decisions, what are the interactions with the client like, what are the interactions with the bank like, and basically going through those going concern assessments. So in the end, that's also where the pilot interviews came in to refine that initial interview guide. But in the end, we had 2 separate interview guides, basically for the more technically experienced people and the going concern panel, as well as specialists, and then one for audit practitioners.
Yeah. And then you end up with a huge data set. In French, you would say a mer à boire. So maybe it goes too far. But could you say something about how you analyze such a data set? That's kind of your expertise, I believe.
So just leading up to this podcast, I was looking up, the average time of the interviews and the total number of hours. And I think in total we have 64 hours of interview data. So that's actually quite a lot. And obviously then, you go through the tedious and long process of transcribing this. And I guess also because most of these interviews, or all of the interviews, were conducted in Dutch, also of translating this and making it accessible to all members of the research team. And then, of course, you need to start analyzing them. And I think to do that, I think it does help to try to get as good as an understanding of what was being said in all of these interviews, so that you try to develop some kind of mapping of key emerging themes that were covered. And of course, your interview guides helps you with that, because that's what you were interested in the first place. But then, of course, you have to think about what was actually sort of the surprising bits, that came up without you expecting that.
Could you give an example how you pick up such a theme?
I guess one of the things that we also picked up was, that in literature there's quite a bit of discussion about the self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that if auditors actually issue a going concern opinion, that is actually sort of the final nail in the coffin of the company, in the sense that then ultimately the company goes bankrupt. But that's something that auditors told us they generally do not experience in practice. So if anything, the self-fulfilling prophecy might be invoked by the client to say, well, please don't issue such a going concern opinion. But it's not that auditors can tell, well, if we sort of really issue this going concern opinion, then indeed the company is going bankrupt.
I think J.B. Bosman also found that in his analysis, right? Well, you also have a theory involved in the study that you use. Well, I think the basic idea is that there are several phases in the decision-making process. Could you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically, and I guess that also resonates with the themes that I was just talking about. So once you have identified a certain set of research themes and broader topics that are being discussed in the interviews, you try to make sense of it. Because otherwise, I think that would be boring for an academic readership to just read about sort of what person A said, what person B said, and so on. So I think the key thing is to actually draw on a certain theory that makes sense of what you actually find in these interviews, and to structure those insights conceptually. And what we ended up doing is, more tentatively, we draw on what is called an actor network theory, that really looks at how a certain focal actor draws on other actors in a particular decision. So how a certain actor mobilizes a certain network to come to a good decision ultimately. And I think that resonates quite well with what we're seeing in the going concern arena, in the sense that we have this usually engagement leader together perhaps with a senior manager or a director, and they actually need to come up with a very difficult decision. And they, as Marshall already said, they don't do that themselves, but rather what happens is that they draw on the whole network of relations within their firm. So it might be that national office and the going concern panel is involved. It might also be that restructuring specialists mostly are involved. But at the same time, they also need to manage the relations with clients. They also need to manage relations potentially with investors and banks, quite often through the client. But then again, for the client, they also have sort of the board of directors as well as management. So there's this whole network of relations involved in this going concern decisions. And those relations need to be managed and coordinated. And that's where this theory actually helps us to make sense of what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the research questions were quite broad. There were no hypotheses or...
Yeah, so that's perhaps also sort of something important to say.
Yeah.
It's not the nature of qualitative research is not that you set out certain hypotheses that you seek to confirm or reject, but it's rather that you ask certain how questions and then go out into the field, as they call it, to answer that question. So quite often people perceive interviews, qualitative research as exploratory, that only helps to pitch certain quantitative research questions or quantitative hypotheses, but that's also not the case. I think the main benefit of interviews is really that you get in-depth insights from practice on a specific phenomenon. And so in that sense, that's also what we try to do. As Marshall said, this has really been a black box in the sense of we don't quite know how these decisions are actually taken in practice. And so what we actually sought to answer was really that question, well, how is that done in practice? And I think that was sort of our, simple research question. And we now seek to define that, refine that based on our theory and really ask, how are these engagement leaders drawing on a certain network of relations and different actors to actually exercise professional judgment, because that's essentially what it is, to exercise professional judgment in such a difficult, complex situation such as a going concern decision.
Yeah. I think this kind of research, this type of research is getting more accepted, or not?
Hopefully.
Well, you see more interview studies in the past decade, I think, than before that, right?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Okay. Well, then we have the findings, of course. What did you find so far?
Yeah, I think the bulk. Of course, we're just starting out the analyses, so we're still at the stage where we're trying to map our empirics or our findings, basically the interviews, to this theoretical framework. So we've identified these different phases on the basis of actor network theory. We've also identified the different actors. So, as Dominic mentioned, the engagement leader, national office or the GCO panel, various types of specialists, the client, of course, and stakeholders, usually banks in this context. And then basically we look at, you kind of get a sort of matrix, between those different phases. So ranging from at what point do you, as the engagement leader, identify triggers with the client that, might lead ultimately to a going concern opinion, or at least triggers you to look into the issue and gather more information. So at what point is a trigger important, significant enough for the engagement leader to mobilize that network, as theory calls it. So that is one stage. And then the next stage would be to actually identify the needs, identify the roles that need to be involved. And then actually the stage where evidence is gathered through different channels. And the final stage, that is really the one that we see most prominent in the archival literature, because all we can see there is, does the auditor issue a going concern opinion or not, which turns out also to entail quite some complicated processes and a lot of application of professional judgment, because whether an uncertainty is material or not, that's where a lot of professional judgment comes in and a lot of deliberation with those various actors. So basically those 4 different stages as sort of columns as we've mapped it now, and then the rows would be the actors, and then per cell we kind of, on the basis of the interviews, we try to identify themes that we see in those cells. Just to give an example, one of the issues that comes up is, at what stage do you actually decide that you need the involvement of a specialist, and to what extent do you involve that specialist in decision making? One of our interviewees talks about buckets. That you might have the bucket where you just have a call with a specialist and just inform them and kind of spar a little bit. Another stage would be where you ask them to do some more activities, and a third stage or bucket would be where you actually make them part of your team. And that, of course, has lots of consequences for the final outcome, which is, again, the only thing that we can see if we look at the archival literature. And here we now have the opportunity to look into that black box and see how those processes look like.
Mm-hmm. So the firm policies are not really strict then?
The firm policies are actually fairly strict, I would say. I mean, there's some variation, but basically all the firms have policies in place in terms of, especially when it comes to, once there is a trigger, they have to go through mandatory consultation, and they have to involve specialists. How it's then being, implemented.
Yeah, they say, this is not a trigger. So you need to define then, is that what's going on, that they don't really know when the moment comes that they need to undertake action or involve a panel or...
That could be something. I mean, that's something that we anticipated, that they might struggle with that, and they do in some cases. But I don't know. I mean, it's too early to give really definitive, findings. But one thing that we notice is that the way they describe it is that they're fairly quick in seeking advice and seeking specialist help, seeking help from the technical department and peer partners that have more experience with these things. So, and that's where this whole network idea comes in as well. You know, they're hardly ever, I mean, there are some exceptions, but in most cases, they really activate that network, and they do so as a result of that uncertainty. So that's a very, very valid question you're asking, you know. How do you know when something is a trigger? Yeah, sometimes they don't, and that's exactly when they need to involve others to help.
Mm-hmm. And I guess ultimately, what we also need to keep in mind is that audit practitioners are also, of course, professionals. So that means that on the one hand, they are the ones who exercise the professional judgment in a particular audit. And then again, they are ultimately responsible for the audit that they're signing, and they're personally signing this, right? So at the same time, of course, the firm also wants to have a certain say in that from risk management perspectives, but also more generally to enhance, I guess, or ensure good quality audits. And so ultimately, there's, I guess, sort of a balancing act between, how much do the firms actually want to influence what audit practice looks like versus to what extent can an audit professional, audit partner, or engagement leader can actually do that by him or herself, right? So in that balancing act is really also something that we're seeing in the interviews. Yeah. So mostly, I guess, in a positive way, that quite often, things are meant in a proactive way in terms of, if you need any help, we are there to help you, but also vice versa, that engagement leaders say, well, I'm facing this very difficult situation. I'm going to reach out to either fellow partners or national office to discuss this.
Yeah. And I thought what also was pretty interesting, too, is the informal network and the formal network. The firms have good policies for the formal network, but a lot of times the engagement leader will reach out informally, and some of that's different by individual, to their peers to see, to seek input, to see if this is a trigger, to see if this is a really serious thing, or what else should I be looking at when I see this. I have very good knowledge of the industry. And so do their peers, so they kind of try to activate them as well. So I think that idea of the formal and the informal network that gets activated was really pretty interesting and very robust.
All right. More examples?
I think one of the things that comes to my mind is the notion of comfort letters. And I think that's something that, several interviewees actually mentioned, that in the past, perhaps auditors were a bit too comfortable with the comfort letters, in the sense of saying if we see that, for example, a parent has issued a comfort letter that they're standing ready for some kind of financial support, that they accept this already as an indication, well, there's no going concern issue by definition because there's a parent available that provides this financial support. And I think there has been sort of this change in attitude as well, both at the firms, but also in practice, that these comfort letters should not be taken for granted as such, right? That there's quite often these are meant mainly for the day-to-day business and to cover, the financial needs on a day-to-day basis, but usually not when they come into the financial difficulties. And I guess that would be one of those examples where, the national office and specialists can offer a more, in this case, legalistic point of view, and also based on their experience, provide some important input that practitioners might not be as much aware of.
Yeah. All right.
Maybe one more thing to add. I mean, one thing that struck us, or struck me at least during the interviews, is how, this is quite a different skill set that is demanded of audit practitioners. I mean, it's not the core financial statement audit, right? It's really different. There might be spillovers, and that's also what we see in the interviews. But at the end of the day, it really requires almost a different mindset, because you have to be much more forward-looking. You have to anticipate those, uncertain events in the future, where financial statement audit is much more backward-looking. So it's good to see that they are taking those opportunities of, seeking help from their network, but it's also something they struggle with, also just for practical reasons. I mean, oftentimes this is a process that is activated rather at the end of the audit, where there's time pressure, deadline pressure because of the audit opinion that needs to be issued, client putting pressure. So yeah, it's kind of a lot of stuff coming together, coupled with maybe lack of full understanding. So it's quite a lot they're confronted with, which most of them are very open about that. It's very challenging.
So it's learning on the job mainly. You cannot learn this in school.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one we asked them as well. How do you learn? How do you make sure you take your team with you? And how do you create some kind of learning environment here? Because, like you say, it's not necessarily something that we can fully teach them. I mean, we obviously in our curriculum, going concern is part of what we teach students. But at the end of the day, you probably, at least that's what many of the practitioners tell us, you almost have to have experienced it, and you have to have almost developed sort of a gut feeling also, And another thing they also tell us, which is, maybe when I say it now, it sounds trivial, but I'm not sure it is, that you need a really thorough understanding of the industry, but also of your client and the business model, to actually be able to deal with those situations in an appropriate way.
Yeah.
And I guess one additional thing is that is perhaps also inherent in this whole network idea. But I think one thing that has been repeatedly emphasized was also the role of communication. And it's really important to communicate to the client what is going on and what's required of the client, because this is also quite an intensive process for everyone involved. Not just in terms of the additional hours, but also in terms of the additional evidence that needs to be provided. And clients are quite often not aware of this. So it seems very important to actually communicate upfront and in a timely manner with the clients, and to educate to some extent also the client on what's coming up and what an emphasis of matter actually entails. That it's not sort of an indication that in the next 12 months they will be bankrupt, but rather an indication that there might be some kind of uncertainty about the next 12 months or in the next 12 months. And so it's really important to actually communicate this and to communicate with all of the actors in this network.
Yes, very interesting. We always try to come up with a 1-minute pitch with a takeaway. So I don't know whether it would be possible to summarize all these things that have been said in 1 minute. What are the most important takeaways?
Yeah, sure. I guess the key point would be that, going concern assessment is not a decision taken by one individual, the signing engagement leader, but that it's really sort of a whole network that is involved in that decision process. And that in turn also means that this whole network needs to be managed and coordinated, mostly by the engagement leader, partly also by the national office, but in collaboration, all these network interactions and relations, they need to be managed. And where we just said communication is key, in a formal way, in an informal way, that managing of the relations is key. But also at the same time, being aware that this is a very intense process, that it's very time consuming and that's very demanding for the clients, but also for the auditor.
Did we forget something that you still want to say? No?
I don't think so.
Well,
I don't think so.
Then I would like to thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.